The sea lay like rough-hewn iron beneath the dawn, a sheet hammered and hammered until its bruised surface took light grudgingly. From the lower yard of storms, and the sound of waves was a constant thing. Not a music, but a reminder, as fundamental as wind in a pine wood or breath in the chest. A ceaseless battering on stone that had learned not to break. Gendry stood in the lee of the forge's open mouth and watched the water until the first sparks of day were strong enough to make the spray burn pale. The forge itself breathed behind him, its heat pressing into his back. Iron smell in his nose like the tang of a struck lip. He had woken before the keep, as he always had, slipping out of the chambers the stewards insisted were his, and finding his way down through corridors, old as songs, to the only place that made sense. A hammer was a tongue he could speak without thinking. The anvil did not change because a man was named, or freed, or dressed in a better cloak. He had no hammer in his hand now. The smiths from the castle's household bent at their work inside. The eldest, a narrow-shouldered man with a nose bent twice, who called himself Tormund, and had treated Gendry with wary respect since the boats first touched the outer steps. A boy with soot-caked hair who moved too fast in the heat. A woman named Lysa who had come from Buckler lands with a handful of nails and a mouth like a pipe slip. They were making spearheads and nails and crude hinges for the doors. The wind was always trying to pry loose. The Stormlands had needs as plain as the forges, and Gendry could understand those too. He looked at his hands. He always did that when he did not know what to do next. The knuckles were scarred with the small, smooth scars that belonged to hot slag and accidental slips, and the pads were thick and pale where gripping had remade the skin. He had new marks there too. Softness where a lord's gloves had sat. Knife slices forgotten by servants who brought him fruit on silver. A graze from a saddle pommel because he had let himself be mounted before checking the girth with his own fingers. The old life felt so close he could taste the ash on it. The new life was a shirt always a little too fine in weave, a collar that chafed. The wind shifted, and the sea spoke a different sentence against the rock. Gendry drew breath, put his shoulders back, and stepped into the forge cave. A salt-white gull peered in from the sill, then hopped away. He took Tormund's tongs without asking, and lifted the dull red billet out of the coals. When the man did not flinch, when Lysa only altered her stance to feed the bellows just so, when the boy reached with a practiced hand for the oil, the world steadied. He put the iron on the anvil and struck, and every strike declared something true. That heat did what it must when asked sternly. That shape yielded to steady purpose. That a line hammered long enough became a blade, and not a thought. The billet thinned and stretched under his rhythm. The racket of it put its own weather in the room. A summer storm of clang and hiss. The sweat came. He bent his neck and let it fall. "My lord," Tormund said eventually. Not loud, not mocking, as a man might warn another that a wagon's wheel is caught, and the team will pull it anyway. Gendry sank the iron back into its bed and pushed it with the tongs until the color righted itself. "Don't call me that in the forge," he said. The words would have sounded foolish in his own ear if he had not already hammered that shape 1,000 times in the last weeks. "Call me Gendry when we work." Tormund's awkward shrug suggested long practice at not offending. "Gendry, then." The maester was by twice already. "The king is to arrive with the tide." "And I will." "John," Gendry said too quickly. The correction felt like a step along a beam too narrow for comfort. "John is to arrive. King or no?" Lysa put in, the bellows whistling as she worked them with a heel and a hip. "It will be the Lord who must go up to the great hall when the banners come through the outer gate. Leave us the iron. It will not sulk." Gendry did not answer. He waited for the billet to glow where it must, tested it with the tongs, and took it out again. The hammer lifted. The hammer came down. Tormund matched his rhythm with scarce touches of the flatter, proud that his hand knew a good line as well as his eye. When at last the blade lay long and honest on the anvil, no finery, no flourishes, he held it up, and the others nodded as smiths nod for work done square. "For a guard," Gendry said, laying the blade in oil and watching the hardened skin gather on it like frost on a window. "There's a boy on the upper bailey whose spear is more spit than steel." 20 boys, Tormund said. 20 spits. "I'll finish the lot," Gendry said. After, when the meeting is done, then so. They did not speak of what must be decided. They did not when a new lord was fitted to a castle like an odd boot on an old foot, and all the toes tried to find their memory about it. Smiths were not immune to fear, but they were faithful to their work first, and that was a kind of prayer. When he climbed the steps, the day had blued to a proper color. Flags snapped hard enough to make a teeth edge in the air. The great drum of Storm's End rose, as if some giant had planted his fist in the cliff for a jest, and left it as a warning, and the galleries and walls swirled around it in layers like a carter's careful coiling of rope. Men were cleaning the sea slick from the great stone steps at the bottom of the seaward face, the only place where the ocean admitted a single stair, and the boatmen were testing the lines and swearing. At the top of the long stair to the inner yard he paused. The castle did not feel like his. He wondered if it ever would. He had been in king's rooms and a queen's tent and a dirty thatch, where a man who had called himself a lord of the crossroads had lived behind a crooked shutter. He had slept beneath trees. This was different. Storm's End was a word made stone, an oath that had become architecture. Everyone who moved within it seemed to do so with knowledge they had inherited as a child and would pass on to theirs. Where to stand out of the wind, which door would not slam in a squall. The way the candles set along the inner curve of a corridor made a man's shadow thin and tall and solemn. A steward found him. The man had a face as smooth as cheese. "My Gendry." He had the grace to stammer. "Wear the yellow cloak for the welcome. It is custom." "The yellow chafes," Gendry said, because the cloak was dyed until it had the brilliance of smashed egg yolk, and it made him feel like a cautionary tale in a midwife's story. The steward did not laugh. Gendry took the cloak anyway. In the great hall, the banners of the Stormlands were already gathered. Some old, some too new, too fresh a dye, too recently mended tears, blood washed out too late, leaving brown ghosts. The buccan crown hung heavier than the rest because the cloth was thick and had been made with a care that seemed to ache in it. Gendry walked beneath and tried not to look up. He had met some of the lords who would stand here. Lord Swan of Stonehelm had sent his brother, a fit man with a rider's legs who liked to talk, and whose eyes slid away instead of meeting. From Night Song, a Karen cousin had come, thin-lipped and sun-creased from the marches, with a hawk on his glove that leashed its fury because he asked it. There were Penroses, one who spoke too fast as if his words were hounds slipping ahead of him, a wild with a poet's hands, a fell who liked to push when conversation gave him his shoulder, two Estermonts so alike they finished each other's emptier sentences. The Dondarrion sent a boy with a scar, and every time Gendry looked at him, he smelled rain and torches and a dead god's wine. Tarth did not send Lord Selwyn. The Evenfall Isle had sent a mailed woman with hair cut blunt and clean, a Tarth of some branch, who had introduced herself with the clarity of armor. "Lady Alisanne of Tarth, we stand with honor. We will see what is honorable here." And no, he had not known what to say to that. He still did not. He looked at his cloak and did not fidget. Footmen, already flushed, came and went between the doors and the dais. The maester stood near the high chair as if someone might ask him to decide where a rib begins and a spine ends. Davos Seaworth was a presence without effort beside him, quiet in a plain coat, whose only pride was clean stitching. Davos had arrived a day before, with a face that made Gendry think of the sea at low noon, when it had spent itself for an hour, and would not admit more. "Don't let the chair sit you," Davos said in a tone that would not carry beyond Gendry's ear. "Sit it yourself. The first thing any of them will look for is whether you know how to put your weight where it counts." Gendry looked at the high chair that had held Baratheons who had been kings and Baratheons, who had been men who ate like farmers and fought like bulls. "I was told it was carved by a man who went mad from the sea's noise." Davos' mouth twitched, his kind of smile. "Many things are carved by men who go mad from the sea's noise. Some of them make more sense than others." "I don't know how to be a lord," Gendry said, simple as warm bread. He could not say it to anyone else that way and not be eaten for it. "You know right from wrong," Davos said softly. "You know the measure of a day's work. You know the price of a lie, and you can hear your own breath when the room gets loud. The rest is horseshoes and flattery, and you'll learn as much of it as you need before you're too old to matter." A trumpet called outside, and the hall reassembled itself. As if someone had spoken a word it had been trained to hear. Gendry felt the heat climb back into his cheeks and did not try to push it down. He walked the steps to the dais and sat the chair. Sat it, put his weight in his heels, found the place where the carved wood did not bite his thighs. He drew the yellow cloak around his shoulders and made it seem a choice. The maester lifted his chin. Davos' hands were folded behind his back like a man waiting his turn at confession. The doors opened, the great ones that had their own weather when they moved, and Salt Wind swaggered in with Jon Snow. Jon looked smaller than any king had the right to look, and larger than any man could carry easily. He wore no crown. He wore a black cloak that had seen better hands at mending. His sword was on his hip, because he did not know what to do with a sword that was not, and because the men he trusted most were the ones who would have thought it strange to leave it elsewhere. The room wanted to stand for him, and did, in a ragged, unsure way that acknowledged too many mysteries to lay them all at one man's boots. Gendry stood because he could not do otherwise. Jon's eyes found him on the dais, and whatever storms moved the world's waters seemed for a heartbeat to draw back and show sand. There were others with Jon. Ghost padded in the twilight of the doorway, white fur ruffled by sea air, the red eyes neither courtly nor savage but something older than both. Sir Davos had one brief, perfectly human smile for the wolf, and it went away at once, too honest to display in front of men with banners. Arya Stark came without announcing herself, half-step behind her brother, wearing leathers that would not apologize. She watched everything and seemed to count it. 1, 2, 3, without moving a finger. Sansa Stark did not come, nor Bran, nor any hand of theirs. It was Jon alone, and what had ridden with him. "Storm's End," Jon said from the threshold, as if greeting an old adversary with whom he had shared bread. He came forward and the room bent around him, then straightened. He halted below the dais and looked up the last steps at Gendry, who made himself stay on the chair when every part of him wanted to jump down and make nonsense of doors and cloaks and carved wood. "Jon," Gendry said. His voice did not crack. That seemed a small miracle. "Gendry," Jon returned. He did not ask how Gendry fared, because the question was a banquet's dish that never satisfied. "The sea's rough. We were glad to find you mending this place." "It mends itself," Gendry said, "if you do not insult it by trying to make it another thing." A breath that could be laughter moved along Arya's mouth and vanished. Jon's eyes measured the hall. Its flags, its faces, the creeping suspicion and the bravado that tried to tame it with laughter or story. He nodded, more to himself than to the room. "Lords of the Stormlands," he said. He did not shout it. The words went out all the same. "I thank you for the welcome. I have not come to bring you a king you did not ask for. I have come to witness whether a son can take his father's house and do it honor." Menderwanis. He did not name the father. He did not need to. A bow of a dozen heads acknowledged the name of Robert Baratheon, without a mouth uttering it. In the back, a man in a green hood spoke to his neighbor, and was shushed. The maester took a breath to remind the room to keep its peace, and then let it out unneeded. Davos moved his weight. Ghost lay down and put his head between his paws, and was an animal who had walked beside men in winter for too long to care what they called themselves when the days softened. Jon climbed 2 steps and stopped, toe on the third as if to say that nothing simple was being taken, and he would not pretend it was. "I ask you to hear me," he said. "You know me, or think you do. I have been lied to, and I have lied by not knowing better. I have fought where I was told, and then where I had to. I do not ask you for oaths to me. I ask whether you will take your own oaths and lay them again at the feet of Storm's End. This man," he used his chin in the Northman's way and not his hand, indicating Gendry. "This man by blood is a Baratheon. By work he is no less. Ben," the rustle in the banners was not wind. "Swan's horse brother, Sardinis," stepped forward with that same rider's economy of effort, as if standing were like mounting. "Your Grace," he said to Jon, and quickly, before the naming of titles could harden, "and Lord Gendry, Stonehelm has questions it would ask before we bend a knee to a secret, not of our making. Ask, Jon said. He did not say that a man who waited for permission to question had not earned the right to ask it. Who speaks for Night Song? The Karen cousin's thin mouth had tightened, but his voice was even. And who speaks for the March? We have held against Dornish knives since before Aegon was a story. A lord cannot be a thing that seems likely. He must be the immovable part of the wall when the wind cuts. Edric Storm is a name, a Wild said almost delicately. A seed of Robert's as true as this one. A thing like this. He waved a hand as if pointing at a table no one else saw. It cannot be gathered and put upon a man as one puts a hat. The crown, too, tried not to remember our oaths until it wished to add them to a column of sums. Then, where is the king? The fell lord had gotten his chin up and would not let it down until someone gave him a reason. Which king? He added with a coarse cheerfulness that made 2 men laugh and 2 others not. Arya stepped a fraction. Jon stilled without moving. Davos' head turned very slightly, measuring where a spark would have to land to do the least harm. Gendry, who had not meant to speak, found that silence had made a fool of him, and opened his mouth to avoid being made a greater one. I am what I am, he said. He did not stand. He did not drop his eyes. I knew none of your rules and had no care for them, and then I knew too many and had less. I can't say better than that, but I know the weight of a promise. A forge's fire eats what you feed it, and iron that lies will show its lie when it cools. I won't lie to this castle or to you. You will not. That is well said, Lady Alysanne of Tarth called, loud enough to cut through men who had planned to roll their words out like new rope. She lifted a fist as if to weight her words with something metal. Who will you make your castellan, Lord Gendry? Her eyes were very blue. Brienne's eyes had been like that, if the songs were true, and if a man who had known her in life had not lied to make his mourning seem better to him. Gendry did not want to answer this lady of her house as if she were a test. He wanted to consider, quietly, and find the end of the thought he had not allowed himself to start because the day had been too crowded. The castle has had its people longer than I have had legs, he said finally. I know the face of the man who sees the grain counts and the woman who keeps the keys to the buttery. They, and Davos Seaworth, if he'll have it, will help me not to make a mess of your lives while I learn how your lives go. Davos coughed in a way that would have embarrassed any man less. I'll advise, he said to the room at large. I've advised worse men with more certainty. The boy, his glance to Gendry had a warmth in it that did not dampen the humor, is stubborn in the right places. Storm's End could do worse for a time, and for a time is all a man ever has, Jon said. It did not sound like a comfort. Your lords will stand and say yes or no. I won't demand it. I will hear your nods, and we will live with them. The Swan man's mouth tightened in something like respect. You make it a courtesy, but it is not. We see that. Stonehelm does not hunger for a war over names. My brother says a lord's first duty is to keep his small folk fed through winter, and we have had too many winters to say it any other way. Stonehelm will bend the knee if the marchers do. That is the truth of it. We hold the roads together, or we are all neighbors to raiders. Nenos. Night Song will not be the first to bend, the Karen cousin said, and said it with weary honesty. We will not be the last. We wait. Grand view? Davos asked softly, to a heavy-lidded man who had not yet found a reason to open his eyes properly. We have always found Baratheons more troublesome as enemies than as friends, the Grandison uncle said, lifting a hand as if brushing a fly away. We will not count reeds. We will kneel. Estermonts, after 3 glances between them, did the same. Penrose dithered and then chose grace. The Wild let his hands say no, and his mouth say yes. And a man who had been born to a brother's wood in the rain house laughed in amazement at his own lord. Morrigan's crow was held still by long fingers, and those fingers set it down as if it might take offense. And then their man spoke for the crow's nest and agreed, and did not seem to like being agreeable. We are men of walls, Lady Alysanne said, when the room's temperature had raised a degree and then settled again. We know what holds a wall up. This is not the worst stone we could have. We will kneel. Then, she knelt. It was a simple act, not theatrical. Others, feeling for the shape of what would not shame them, went with her. Some turned their faces aside as if cutting onions. Two lords stood stiffer as if a piece of them was being asked to bend that had never bent. And one of them did it suddenly, the way a stubborn hinge yields all at once to oil. The Karen cousin was the last, and his mouth was tired, but he lowered it. Jon climbed the last steps after that and stood beside Gendry, not above him. He did not lay a hand on Gendry's shoulder, as a true king might have, and in not laying it, he made something happen that Gendry could feel in the breath of the room. It was a kindness and a duty both. "Then hear me," Jon said. "To all of them. By right of blood and bone, and by the need of these lands, I ask you to acknowledge Gendry Baratheon as Lord of Storm's End, rightful in his person and in his keeping of you. Not because I say it, because you do." The maester's voice shook when he spoke the words that made it legal. Gendry had not liked the maester and found in that moment that men were large enough to hold contradictions without breaking. He went to his knees and put his hand to the cool of the stone, and the stone did not move under it. He rose when he was told to rise. Arya, watching him, did not smile. Ghost slept the sleep of a beast who had run 30 miles on air. There were more formalities. There always were. A cup to be passed, a weight to be sworn, a piece of parchment to be scarred with wax. Tormund would have said a spearhead needed only to bite. All else was wasted iron. Gendry said the words he was told and learned that though they tasted of salt, they went down. Davos stood behind his left shoulder and murmured once, twice, when a phrase wanted to hook him where it pleased and make him stumble. Jon did not speak again until the last wax drop was hard. Then Jon said, with that plain directness that had made too many men want to love him or hate him, and too few able to do either and survive, "I must ask a thing of you, Lord Gendry." Gendry did not look at the maester or at Davos. He looked at the man who said his name as if it were not a weight but a truth. "Ask. There are men of the Stormlands who rode with the wrong banners and now have no roofs to sleep under," Jon said. "Some did it because they liked what they thought the wrong banners meant. Some because they were hungry. We need the ones who can be bent to better use, not broken to make a point. Will you take them in if they come with the right hand open? Will you put them to work where work redeems a man faster than a song?" Gendry felt the forge heat again, in the marrow, as if the iron he had lifted an hour ago had been a piece of him. A man who will lift a hammer with both hands can make a hinge, or a sword, or a door that does not slam in the wind, he said. "Bring them. If they lie, we'll know it by winter." Jon nodded. There was a shadow beneath his eyes that had not gone away in months. "There will be winter," he said, "even when the snow does not fall." The hall emptied the way surf withdraws, leaving wet stone and the tide line of a feast untouched. Men who had knelt but still distrusted what their knees had admitted found reasons to examine flagstones carefully, or speak softly of hawk's talons. The steward bowed himself into a posture that indicated roasted meats and a fish as long as a woman's arm. Davos murmured that the kitchens had done better with less, and the steward blanched with professional shame. Jon waited until the last lord with a grievance had been shown the corridor to the small chamber where he could rehearse his grievance in private to a sympathetic cushion. "What do you need?" Jon said, when it was quiet enough that the question could be a simple one. Gendry could have said 5,000 bushels of barley and a road that did not flood 3 times a year. He could have said smiths whose hands had not been turned to carving spearheads for 10 winters running. He could have said time. "A man I can trust to keep the peace around the kitchens," he said, surprising himself. "There's 3 old women there who run the place like a sept, and they've started a war with the men of the outer ward about boiled onions versus roasted. They'll cut each other for fat." Jon's laugh was a thing he did not let out often. It sounded relieved by its own existence. "I can send you a woman," he said. "She once taught a castle's kitchen to feed a company of wildlings with half a bag of oats and a bucket of eel, and made them thank her for it." "But you won't like her." "I don't like onion soup," Gendry said. "Send her." They walked down from the dais together. Arya checked the ties on her gloves and ran her palm lightly over Ghost's flank. When Gendry came close, she looked up at him for a long breath. He did not know what he should see in her face, only that it was not easy to be seen by it. "So, Lord of Storm's End?" she said. The way she said it made it seem that she had a right to test whether it fit in her mouth. "So," Gendry said. His throat had tightened. He had once asked her something with less caution, at a smithy's mouth, with no weight on it, but what his heart could carry. That had been a thing that taught him his own limits. Some lessons did not need repeating. "You'll have need of eyes," Arya said. "Not only on your walls, on your roads. There are men who will not bend to a lord's name, no matter how honest the man is. I can ask questions on your behalf if you like. I can listen. Men don't see what they don't think is there. Men are manned." "I would be glad," Gendry said, and heard how bare glad made him sound, and did not mind. Arya cocked her head. "Don't get yourself killed learning to be agreeable, Gendry Baratheon. Men die of that as surely as they die of fever." "I'll keep an oar in my hands when I swim," he said. It came out, and for a moment her eyes brightened, the way steel catches a stray spark off flint. Then she nodded. "Good," she said. "I brought you something." She reached into the fold of her leather and produced a little thing wrapped in oiled cloth. Gendry took it. His hands wanted to open it there, between one breath and the next, and he did not. She nodded again, approving something. "Later. When the wind is on the land and not the sea," she said, in that voice that knew the languages men did not know they were speaking. Jon found Davos and said something Gendry could not hear. Davos' face made a shape that might have been irritation softened by affection. The three of them, Jon, Davos, Arya, were a separate weather system inside that hall, and for a heartbeat Gendry wanted to stand in it and be blown clean. He stood where he was. "Walk with me," Jon said then directly, as if that thought had been a pebble in his boot and could not be ignored. They went out together into the corridor where the candles made a man's shadow long, and then out into the yard. The wind climbed without apology from the sea and pushed them both as if daring them to take a step. Jon squinted into it, hair blown across his brow, and put his hand on the wall because that was the sensible thing to do. Gendry did not reach for the wall. He looked out and let the wind try to take him. Inside his shirt, Arya's little package lay against his ribs, small and patient. "I did not come to wear a crown," Jon said. The wind stripped the words of softness. "I came because I have made a habit of involving myself where the realm frays, and it frays here. The Stormlands have always been more stubborn than clever, and clever men have always counted that in their sums. We need stubborn where we are going." "We," Gendry said. "Where are we going?" Jon's smile was thin. "Somewhere I cannot see from here. I have learned it is better to admit that than to pretend and lead men into a ditch." "Bens." Gendry looked at his hands again and found himself amused by the fact of it, as he always was when he caught himself in old habits. "I can make hinges that will not squeal," he said. "I can make arrowheads that bite instead of bend." "Make them," Jon said. "Make them for your people. Make a place men can come to and learn how to be part of a thing that stands instead of breaks. That is a king's work. You can do it without the name." "You could," Gendry said before he could stop himself. The words clinked on the stone between them like dropped coin. Jon's eyes, winter clear, did not turn away. "I could," he said. "And there are some who will not let me, and there are some who may. I cannot be both everywhere and the man I am. I can help you be your part of what must be." They were quiet a while. The water shouldered the cliff. A gull fought the air and won and lost again, and took no instruction from men about it. At last Jon said in a voice that belonged to a cold morning on a wall of ice, "Your father loved. He loved hard and foolish and in the open. And he frightened men who could not admit they longed to do the same. That made him a bad king and a good friend, and a worse enemy and a banner. You will not be him. Do not try. He was a storm that taught men to build. Be the wall that does not mind the storm." "Then?" Gendry thought of the forge and the way iron sang its compliance and its refusals. He nodded. "I can try." "Good." Jon put his hand out then and gripped Gendry's shoulder. It was not a king's benediction. It was the grip of a man who had come a long way on tired feet and was proud of another for standing. See to your lords. See your roads. Watch the marchers especially. The Prince of Dorne and I have an understanding that looks like a bridge until a man forgets it is 3 boards wide and a good wind could take him off. We do not need raiding this winter. I'll send riders to Nightsong and the Boneway, Gendry said. A man from each house to stand with mine in the border villages. They can argue about cooking fires and who owns which goat until the goats get used to being owned by men who don't sharpen knives in their sleep. And so, Davos, who had come out behind them and now leaned in the archway as if he had always been there, said, "That's the sound of a plan with fewer holes than most I've heard in fine rooms. We'll need parchment and men who can read and write, which makes parchment our first difficulty." "Lysa," Gendry said, "from the forge. She writes a fine hand. She can set the names down while I put the men to the gate to take a second look at who passes. We'll make lists. Lists make fewer mistakes than memory." "Mentor." Arya came up with the wind holding on to her as if it were her squire and had not been dismissed yet. "I can find you your worst problems and bring them to your table with their hats in their hands," she said to Gendry. "If you put them to work, put them somewhere they can see the sea. It makes men more honest to have something in front of them that does not care who they are." "I'll build more windows," Gendry said, and half smiled to find the jest had weight to it. "I will need stone." "You have a castle," Davos said, dry as driftwood. "Take a piece off the part that keeps trying to fall on the outer steps and pretend you meant it." They stood and looked at the water as if it were a thing that might change if they outstared it. It did not. Some truths were a comfort by their refusal to be otherwise. Later, when the sun was up and the kitchen war was paused by meat, and the argument about onions moved to the back hearth where the women could quarrel with cleavers to hand, Gendry found a narrow room in the northern face of the keep, where the wind came prince-like and the light did not disdain to enter. He closed the door and sat on the bench under the single arrow slit. He took out the small packet Arya had given him and unwrapped it. Inside was a nail. Not just any nail. He knew it the way a man knows the weight of his own hammer in a dark room. He had made it in a smithy, in a village whose name he could not have told a lord, but whose step he could have walked blind. He had made it because a girl had asked him for something easy to hide, and easy to drop, and easy to pierce. A nail with a broad enough head to bite. A shaft slim and honest. He had put it in her hand, and she had smiled in a way that was not soft, and had gone away and used it to take out a man at a crossroad, whose name had been too heavy and too loud. He held it on his palm and did not weep. He laughed a little, under his breath without bitterness. "All right," he said, to the iron and the sea, and whatever else was listening. "All right." The days that followed did not become easier because a room had shouted truth, and then become quiet. They became the kind of days a man could lay one next to the other, and see whether a line formed. Storm's End ate labor as the sea ate boats. Gendry woke early and put his hand on the walls where they sweated with their own weather, and sent men with lime to fill the places that the wind had been courting. He rode with Davos to the outer farms, and spoke in a voice that did not sound like command, and did not sound like pleading either. He ate with the kitchen women at a table none of the lords thought to enter, and let them show him where his seal should go, when the sausage makers wanted more gut. He learned the names of the footmen at the inner gate, not because he loved names, but because men who are named once and for the right reason do a better job at watching whose cart rolls through, without asking if the boxes stacked in the back might be heavier than onions. He sent for a Tarth mason from Evenfall, and put him to work on the outer steps, with a promise not to insult the stone by pretending it was young. He sent riders to Nightsong and Stonehelm with letters that Lysa wrote and sealed and sanded. He put his seal where he must, and not where he did not understand why it was called for. He earned 2 grudges from men who had expected to be given tasks with feathered edges, and found themselves directed to the stables instead, and 3 small, fierce loyalties from boys who got warm boots and a place near a brazier because he had noticed the way they hid their fingers in their sleeves. At night, when the wind had tired itself out enough to let men sleep, He went to the forge and made things for the castle that none of the lords would notice until they were broken. Hinges without squeal, latches that did not bite, a new spit for the kitchen big enough to carry a boar. He could not stop. Work kept his thoughts from arranging themselves in ugly shapes. Jon came and went. He always had, even when he had stayed longer than any man could. He rode south to talk to a Tyrell cousin who had decided he was still a Tyrell despite vines being ash. He rode north to a marsh where men had built their houses on sticks and could not be made to move by reason. He returned and spent a day with Gendry and Davos eating cheese ends and discussing the price of saltfish from the east coast and how many boats a man could ask from a village before the village lost itself. He slept on a pallet instead of a bed and looked older when he woke. Arya was shadows and sunlight. Sometimes she appeared beside Gendry at the parapet and said the names of 3 men who had been seen near the Marcher Road with too much good steel on them to be honest travelers. And by the week's end, those men had either come to Storm's End with their caps off and been set to carrying lime, or had chosen to vanish eastward like fog in a wind. Sometimes she was gone long enough that Gendry found himself walking the inner curve of the drum tower at night and measuring his breath against the stones. When she returned, she would sit with Ghost and clean her blades and tell him a very short story that began with a marketplace and ended with a man counting wrong. She gave him a new nail now and then, with a head the size of a coin or the size of a barleycorn, and he kept them in a wooden box in his chamber that had once belonged to a Baratheon who wrote bad poetry when the sea kept him inside. The Stormlands learned him a little, and he learned them. The wind made fewer jests of his cloak. A child with hair like wet straw looked at him as if he were a painting, and then sneezed. A lord who had wanted to be obeyed because his father had been obeyed came to him with his hat in hand to ask for help getting a footbridge rebuilt. "My people will starve," he said, and seemed shocked that he meant it. Gendry went out one morning with only 2 men, because sometimes a lord must be seen without a forest of spears. They took the road toward Nightsong, which cut through a wood where the trees had bent to the wind for so many years that they had become a catalogue of humilities. Davos had business with a beeman there who had once saved a cargo of onions by making the men who wanted them pay with honey in the spring. It rained without making a story of itself. On the way back, 2 boys stepped from the trees holding spears they were not old enough to trust. Gendry ran in. The men behind him did not lower their hands to their sword hilts. He held his own hands where he could see them and waited and said nothing. And the boys, who had wanted to be men, found themselves with the time it takes for silence to turn into the beginning of wisdom. One of them had a scar that had been made by a mouth that wanted to eat more than it was given. The other looked at Gendry's cloak and saw the dye and not the man. "We want," the first said, and then stopped, because people who have always taken have a hard time making a sentence with want in it. "What do you want?" Gendry said. His voice was not soft. He would not make a father out of himself for boys he did not know. The second boy took his courage by the ear and dragged it forward. "Work," he said, and breathed as if he had put down a barrel. "Can you lift a bucket?" Gendry said. "Yes," they said. Together, eager to be made useful or forgiven or both. "Can you stand on a wall at night and keep your eyes open where the wind puts water in them?" he asked. "Yes," they said, and did not know yet that it was a promise that would change what their names meant when they said them from then on. "Then come," Gendry said. "There's lime to carry and a bridge to put back, and if you take a loaf from the pantry without asking, the woman in charge will flay you with her tongue and put you back together with gravy." They grinned, relieved, and then remembered to stop grinning. Gendry did not smile back. He did not need to. They came, and they learned that a wall is a friend if you treat it as one, and that sleep is a thing a man earns honestly. Nights fell and rose. Storm's End breathed. Men remembered to say Storm's End without worrying that their mouths would be full of salt for a day, because they had spoken an oath wrong. Winter did not come, not in the way men from the north use the word, but the wind learned it a sharper edge, and the rains were colder when they struck, and left a numbness like an old memory behind them. In the quiet between forward moments, when no one needed him to say this or seal, That, or choose a man who would not be chosen softly. Gendry would go to that narrow room and sit under the arrow slit and take one of Arya's nails from the box and hold it. He did not have a prayer, he said. He found himself making one without noticing. Not to gods, to iron, and to the kind of work that is honest, because it is too hard to lie. One night Jon came to him there. Gendry did not know how long Jon had been standing in the doorway. The wind had not noticed him, and neither had the candle. He simply was, as snow can be, when it decides to be in a place. Word from the march, Jon said softly. A Karen has died, the cousin you met, thrown from a horse. Gendry's hands tightened on the nail as if it were a man's fingers. Horses can be honest, and they can be the other thing, he said, because it was what there was to say. Jon nodded. There will be a scramble. The marchers prefer to settle their matters by who can climb fastest, rather than by who can hold once they have climbed. We will need to step in without making it look like a boot from the capital. There is no capital, Gendry said, and immediately regretted how that sounded. He had not meant to cut. Jon's mouth moved. No, he said. There is no capital. There are places where men try to make one. Damn. They talked then, for an hour, not like kings and lords, but like two men who had found themselves shaping a thing larger than either of them with the tools they had. They talked roads. They talked which lords had daughters to marry, and which had sons that had learned to read. They talked food. They talked, finally, about the men who had chosen to go on accounting for their lives with swords when swords had ceased to pay. I can take some into my service, Gendry said. Make a company that rides the march with my banner and eats my bread and has to answer to my kitchen women when they come back with mud on the floor. If they swear me, not their old promises, I can shape them. Jon looked at him, and there was pride there, and something like sorrow, and something else Gendry could not name. Do it, he said. When men swear you because you are useful and honest, they are yours in a way that a crown cannot make them. And if some break, he shrugged. Men break. Metal breaks, Gendry said. You throw it back in the fire and try again. Or you learn to make that piece into a hook instead of a blade. Men know. Jon's smile was that thin one again, the one that held the least pain. Hooks are underrated, he said. When Jon slept, finally, Gendry sat with the nail and thought not of kings or of fathers he had not had or of courts that had let him be a joke, and then a tool and now a symbol. He thought of the two boys on the road, and of Lysa's hand steadying the parchment while she shook the sand onto the ink, and of the way Lady Alysanne had knelt with such simple grace that it made other men's forced kneelings less ugly. He thought of the sea, and how it did not care, and how that was a mercy. Storm's End had taken him. Not as a son. Not yet. More like an apprentice. It would watch his hands. It would let him make mistakes it could survive and would not forgive the ones it could not. That seemed fair. When dawn came, it came dry and clear, a rarity that made even the gulls less rude. Gendry went to the forge and hammered a line into a length of iron until it learned to be straight, because there were days for swords, and there were days for hinges, and a man who could not tell which day it was did not deserve either. He worked until the heat forced him to step back and drink, and when he leaned in the doorway for a breath, he saw Davos crossing the yard with a sheaf of papers that had offended him by existing. Behind him came Lady Alysanne and two men in the colors of Stonehelm. Above them, in the pale sky, a hawk circled, patient and sure of its own place. Gendry set the iron aside and went to meet the day. The nail in his pocket lay poorly against the bone, and then found its place and rested there. A small, honest weight reminding him with every step that work done right did not forget a man. He did not smile. He did not frown. He walked with the wind pulling at his cloak, and it seemed to him that for once the wind was not trying to take something from him, so much as trying to see where he would go. Oh, hi. The pages Davos carried were stiff with dried salt, and their corners had learned the shape of his hand. He laid them on a barrel in the yard as if setting a supper out, and the wind tried to take the top one, and could not. Lady Alysanne tucked a lock of hair behind her ear and did not pretend to be patient. The men in swan colors stood at parade's ease, which is to say they looked as if their spines were all different opinions of the same rule. "News from Nightsong," Davos said. "The Cairn cousin's dead as we heard. Another cousin says he's the cousin who counts. A steward says the gods alone choose the cousin who counts, and the gods have chosen him. A hedge knight in their service says, rather loudly, that if he's not listened to soon he'll find other lords who listen with a purse in their hands." "And Shawan, that would be Sir Othmar," Lady Alysanne said. "He has ears like a rabbit, and courage to go with them, and a company at the Boneway harrying small folk within 2 miles of the boundary stones." Davos went on. "The prince in Sunspear, whichever prince it is this week, sends word that if the marchers want peace, they might try behaving like men who desire it. Sir Denys Swan blew his breath out his nose like a horse who had found the bit in his mouth and did not love it. And if the men of will want peace, they might stop calling stealing a kind of harvest. They call it a kind of tax," Davos said mildly. "Takes the same coin from a farmer in the end." Gendry looked at the seal threads, the sloped hands that had written them. You could tell the kind of life a man led by how he wrote. Some letters were all degrees, the clerks who believed a straight line could keep the land from sliding under them. Some letters curved like willow whips, fast and loose, the men who expected the ground to move and knew to put their weight right. Liza's hand was steady as a man who had learned to stand on a deck. The steward of Nightsong had written as if his quill were a spear, and the parchment a man he did not yet know if he would have to kill. The hedge knight's complaint had been dictated. The clerk who took it down had put an extra loop on the G in gold, as if to remind the hearer what bones he wanted his stew to be boiled from. "We ride," Gendry said, "with enough spears to make a circle that looks like a circle, not a host. If a host comes, men who do not need to die will find ways to do it." "Denys." "Lord Swan," Denys corrected cheerfully, because his brother was Lord Swan, and he liked the title even if it belonged to someone else. "Denys," Gendry said again, and Denys grinned, satisfied. "If Stonehelm men ride with us, can they stand next to Dondarrion without chewing the inside of their mouths bloody?" "I'll not have a host, but I'll have a sight. I've eaten worse than the sight of a Dondarrion," Denys said. "We'll ride with them. If their lad's the one coming, I'll be careful how I speak to him. He's been struck by lightning more times than is habitual for boys." "He's been struck by men more often," Davos murmured. "Send word to Blackhaven," Gendry said. "Ask for their banner and 6 good riders, and send to Evenfall for that mason's brother. If Nightsong's gate has been hit by carts more than by battering rams, we'll need a man who understands what kind of break that makes." Lady Alysanne inclined her head. "You ride with knights and courtiers," she said. "I will bring you a woman who knows who actually opens the doors." They left by noon. There was no point in waiting for a better wind on a day that had chosen its temperament. Gendry wore a cloak that had been cut with honesty and dyed without vanity. He took men from the inner ward as well as lords' retainers, one from the forge, one from the kitchen yard, one who had learned to read enough to count sacks, one who had never learned and made no promise to try. He had the new-made spearheads wrapped in oiled cloth in a cart, because you did not ride into a marcher quarrel with your hands empty and expect men to admire the clean lines of your wrists. The road west ran along the cliff, and then turned inland through a wood that had more wind in it than many men had in their lungs. The trees leaned and held their lean like old soldiers holding their injuries just so. They passed farms where the stone walls had been rebuilt 3 times in 20 years, and still stood as if they were not yet tired of it. Children stared because children always stared at banners, and an old woman made the sign of the mother, and then spat because the wind had put salt on her tongue. A herd of pigs crossed the road in a kind of argument with itself, and Denys Swan rode through them with his heels up in his stirrups, laughing. At an inn that was not an inn when the weather was bad, a long stone building with a roof the wind had not managed to take, Dondarrion riders met them. The boy with the scar was there. It ran from his left temple down across his cheek and had knitted in a ropey way over old thin flesh. Gendry could not keep from smelling rain when he looked at it. The boy was named Edwin, and his father had died to a man who called himself king. and had been king enough to make dying for him mean something and nothing both. Edwin's bow to Gendry was careful and full of concentration, like a craftsman's first try at a new jig. "Blackhaven sends you its banner," he said, "and 6 riders who will try not to spit when they see Stonehelm." "We won't spit," one of the Dondarrion men said, affronted to find himself accused of something he had planned to do. "There's not enough water in our mouths for it." Denny Swan and the Blackhaven men looked at each other without moving their heads, and then each looked subtly past the other at the horizon. And it pleased the wind, which rustled the thatch approvingly and moved along. They came to Night Song toward evening, and if names had mirrors, this castle's would have been a weathered one hung in a barn, showing a woman the truth of herself whether she wanted it or not. The walls were high because of neighbors, not for show. The banners that stirred with reluctance were old. Men had cared for them as one cares for a boot that must keep a foot dry another winter, or the foot will rot. The gatehouse looked as if it had been struck not by rams, but by bad temper and carts laden wrong, just as Gendry had guessed. A captain at the gate took one glance and decided to be a man who had wanted to do the right thing all along. He whisked them through, as if no garrison had ever been suspicious of men who came with a new lord and a new lord's friends. In the inner yard, 2 men stood a little too near each other in the way of rivals trying to let the wind decide who would speak first. One wore a chain not because he was maester, but because he had found it in a chest and judged it improved his neck. The other wore nothing that announced him, and stood as a man who believed the ground would not move, just because his stomach did. The hedge knight, Othmar with rabbit ears, lounged near a water trough, eyeing the horses as if they were ladies whose honor he would not mind carrying to the next village. "Lord Gendry," said the chained man with impressive haste, "we are grateful. No, we are relieved. No, we are restored by your presence. I am Ragnar Caron, cousin to the late cousin. I am prepared, no, I am obliged, to take the charge of Night Song and its people, who have been left like sheep in a windstorm. You see before you a man without ambition who nonetheless understands duty." "I see a chain that doesn't belong to you," Arya said from nowhere. And both men started as if a door had opened in a wall they had known all their lives. She stepped into sight with Ghost drifting at her knee like a snowbank that had learned mischief. The other man, thick wrists, fingers that had spent most of their lives around tools and were now trying to learn how to clasp behind a back, bowed. "Harold Long," he said, "steward to 3 lords of Night Song, 2 honest and 1 who was never sure whether to be. If the Lord will have it, I will keep the house until the family's matter is settled and keep the ledger in front of me, while men talk, so they cannot pretend not to see it." "Bembelwar. Where's the body?" Gendry asked, because it would need asking, and because the wind had done him the courtesy of pushing the word out of his mouth. Harold looked at the ground. Ragnar fluttered in the way of men who cannot help being theatrical, even when the theater is a church. "Buried," the chained man said. "In honor, with proper words. In haste," Arya said. "In decent time," Ragnar corrected, which meant in haste. "We did not wish carrion." "Who stitched the shroud?" Davos asked, not looking at anyone in particular. "I'd ask her how long the cloth lay unused before it was needed." But Harold flicked his eyes toward the kitchens. The captain at the gate shifted his weight. Men had told on themselves with less. "We'll look at the tack," Gendry said. "And the stable he fell in. And we'll talk to his horse. And to the woman who stitched his shroud. And then we'll sit and talk of chains and of ledgers." Bah. Ragnar spread his hands in the posture of men who are about to be shown to be fools and are trying to anticipate forgiveness. "My lord." "Surely a lord has men to do such lookings for him." "He does," Gendry said. "I brought them." The stable smelled of horses and old hay, and a little of the honesty men have when they speak to animals. Gendry ran his hand along the harness pegs, as if expecting a peg to tell him a story. And sometimes they did. That this strap had been hung in a hurry because a man had had to piss. That this girth had been left where it was because an old man had known where it would be in the morning that way. The dead Charon's mare blinked at him with a soft gravity, then leaned toward his chest with the curiosity of a creature who has known the shape of grief around her and wondered if it tasted like apples. The girth strap lay coiled on a saddle horse, as it had been dried after cleaning. Gendry took it up and turned it in his hands. He knew leather. It is a cousin of iron. It remembers the heat of the body and the pressure of the world, and shows a man what was done to it if he does not insult it by not looking. Near the buckle, inside the fold, someone had nicked the strap with a sharp blade, and then polished the cut with tallow. It would hold long enough to seem trustworthy, and then tear as if the horse had suddenly grown stronger than any horse ever born. He set the strap down. He put his thumb on the cut just once. He looked at the mare and then at the floorboards. There was a place where the boards had taken a man's weight wrong, because he had dropped suddenly, and the mare had jumped and dragged him, and then stopped. Good mare that she was, even with men shouting. "Which boy handles the tack?" Gendry asked, softly. A boy stepped out of a straw shadow with the despairing courage of someone who had been under a bed and had decided to be brave. He had narrow hands and a mouth that believed in honesty the way it believed in summer thunderstorms, inevitable, loud, to be endured with the animals. "My lord," he said, "I clean and oil and hang. And sometimes I do not do it right." "You did it right," Gendry said, because he could see where the boy's hand had treated the strap with oil that had grit in it from the yard, and the nicked part had been rubbed with tallow that had no grit in it because a man had done it at a table, not in this stable. "Who gave you this strap to clean the day before your lord rode?" "Ser Othmar," the boy said, terrified to say the name, terrified not to. Said his straps was fine, and this one needed it. Said he'd seen sweat gathered in the fold. "Nender one." "He would have," Davos murmured. "Sweat and tallow both look like forgiveness once they dry." Arya was gone. She had not made a sound going. Ghost's ears tipped forward and then flattened again, the way a hound's will when it grows bored of the human part of a hunt, which is slower. They found Othmar by the water trough where he had been standing. Men who cannot feel when the air moves against their skins are men who do not notice when a noose is being woven by a woman with a knife. He looked at Gendry with a face that could learn to be contrite if contrition paid. "The girth," Gendry said. "My lord?" Othmar's rabbit ears could not help him hear. "You brought a girth strap to a boy who oils gear," Gendry said. "Because you care about leather." Othmar licked his lips. "I care about safety," he said. "I saw sweat in the strap." "You saw opportunity," Gendry said. "Barrels don't roll themselves downhill unless someone gives them a push. Ser Othmar has served night song in 3 winters." Ragnar Karen said from the fringe, hand to his chain as if to keep it from telling tales about the neck it warmed. "He has." Arya flickered at Gendry's shoulder like wind changing directions. She showed him a small blade, then closed her hand on it again. "His belt knife matches the cut," she said softly. "The tallow on it smells of kitchen fat. The cook keeps a bucket with rosemary in it for the pans, and the blade smells of that." "Bendawan." "Ser Othmar," Gendry said again, as a man might say the name of a horse he was thinking of gelding. "Who told you you'd be listened to if you were suddenly the only man who could keep the march for a lord who was gone?" Othmar looked at Ragnar, because men who can think only one thought at a time always look to the man with a chain on his neck when caught. Ragnar spread his hands again. "I cannot be held accountable for what rabbit-eared men hear when they misinterpret duty," he said, and disappointment at being discovered made his vowels long. "Maester," Davos asked politely over his shoulder, as if inviting the man with the chain to be the thing he pretended to be. "I am not a maester," Ragnar said irritably. "Our maester died the winter before last, and we have waited." "So you are a man wearing a chain," Davos said. "Whatever that makes you, it does not make you less than what you are. An ambitious cousin who thought it would be easier to be honest if the lord who might have objected to your honesty were somehow not riding his horse." The yard had filled itself with people the way a cup takes wine. They were not pressed tight yet. They waited to see whether to touch shoulders with one another or with steel. Gendry felt the iron in his marrow warm, as if it had been placed too near a banked fire. He stepped closer to Othmar and set his hand on the man's shoulder. The rabbit ears went flat, and the man's jaw clicked with swallowings. "There's work to be had at Storm's End," Gendry said. "Hard work. The kind that doesn't leave a man enough breath to tell lies to the wine on a night. A man could be redeemed at it, if he wanted to be, and if he could learn a craft and keep his head down and not speak unless he was asked, and never touch a strap he was not told to touch. A man could also be hanged. Which are you?" Othmar's mouth opened. It did not close for some time. When it did, his nostrils fluttered like a frightened colt's. "I don't want to hang," he whispered. "No one wants to hang," Arya said, flat as a whetstone. "The choice is what you do before it." Gendry let his hand go from Othmar's shoulder. He turned to the yard. "Hear it," he said. "There's a hole in Night Song where a lord should be, and two men decided to fill it with themselves. They cut a strap to make a story, and the story would have ended with more dead than one. We will not have it. Harold Long will keep Night Song for Night Song. He will write every bushel of grain, and he will speak every man's name who comes to claim a thing, and he will write the name again if the woman in the kitchen says it is not the right name. The cousin with the chain will take that chain off. He will wear his neck as it was made. If he keeps speaking when he is not asked, he will find himself learning to make hinges for Storm's End. And if he makes bad ones, he will learn to sweep." "Bow." Regnar's mouth made a sound like cloth tearing. He reached for the chain. He held it. He set his jaw. He took it off. It made a small, pathetic chime when the links met. "And you," Gendry said to Othmar, "you can learn a trade, or you can die for murder with a kitchen knife. Choose now." Othmar chose with tears on his face, and snot in his mustache, and a terror that made him honest in a way he had not been since he was 10. "I'll work," he said. "Then go with the riders carrying the cart with the spearheads," Gendry said. "And keep your hands in sight." There was a hiss in the crowd that might have been anger, or might have been approval. The two can sound alike when a room has not yet decided what it is. Arya watched faces, not mouths. Davos watched shoulders. Denny Swan watched the roof lines for archers because he could not help being a man who had learned to duck before he learned to stand. Harold Long bowed, not deep, not ostentatious. "I will keep the ledger in front of me," he said. "Doe," Gendry said, "and find the shroud stitcher. She will sit on the dais when claims are heard for a fortnight. If she shakes her head at any man while he speaks, he is to leave off speaking." "Men chow." "The gods are good," Harold murmured, "when they give us a lord who loves women who do hard work." "The gods have little to do with it," Davos said, "but they do like a good ledger. The stranger keeps one." Word went ahead of them to the Boneway, as word always does, faster than ravens when it is carried by men who wish to be first to tell the tale. Gendry kept his company small. He sent the Stonehelm men a mile to the left, the Dondarrion men a mile to the right, so that any man who watched would see 3 different kinds of horseflesh and 3 different kinds of banner, and decide to keep his arrows where they were. The land changed under their horses' feet. Rock that had felt more sun, scrub that had learned to bite men who did not respect it. There were boundary stones, graven with names as old as the first quarrels. Men had bled over them, and then forgotten they had bled. The stones did not care. They kept their places with the blank patience of things that understood their own purpose. At the inn that pretended not to be an inn when Dornishmen came through, a party of Yronwood riders waited, their captain wearing yellow and rust, and the expression of a man who enjoys being reasonable as long as other men see he is capable of being unreasonable. "I am Ser Nemor Alarion," he said, which was interesting in its own small way, because the man wore no sun and spear and no green lizard lion, and the Illyrians of God's grace had no love for the Yronwoods beyond practical neighborliness. "I ride from the Boneway for the Lord of the Boneway, who rides for the Prince in Sunspear. This is how the world is arranged today." Gendry nodded. "I am Gendry Baratheon," he said. "I ride for Storm's End, and if I ride clumsily, that is my concern." Ser Nemor smiled with real amusement and let it become politeness. "We have had goats straying," he said. "Some of them strayed north and came back without their kids. This upsets goatherds. more than the loss of a cousin sometimes. We have had men thrown from their horses and called thieves because they were not on their own side of the stone when the horse regained its senses. This upsets our men. Our men sometimes give goats husbands they do not own. This upsets your men. Then, is there a way to keep everyone's upset to a degree that allows them to eat? Davos asked pleasantly. And to sleep? There is always a way to make men sleep, Sir Nemor said. Food is harder, but we might try. Then they went up to the stones and sat on them, because sometimes the best way to keep a line in men's minds is to put their arses upon it while they speak. Arya sat not on a stone, but on the thick root of a hawthorn that had decided to be both on one side and the other for a century and had suffered no for it. Ghost lay in a sliver of shade and watched flies. Gendry put his hand on the stone and spoke the language of ledgers, because the march respects a tally more than a song. If a goat is taken across this line, he said, it can be paid for in 3 ways. With coin, with salt fish from our coast, which will not go bad on your men before it reaches their pots, or with iron nails for your doors and wagons, each with a head true and a shaft that will not split the wood when it is driven. We will make the nails. We will sell them cheap enough to make stealing goats less attractive. If a man who has taken a goat would rather swing than pay, he will swing. I will swing him on this side. You may swing him on yours. It will set a good example to goat and man both. Now, Sir Nemor's hand stroked the stone as if it were a hound that had not decided whether to accept his presence. Nails, he said. We can bring you olives and oil, and the kind of wine that does not make a man's head ache if he drinks a cup and then remembers his wife. We have women who make soup that takes the headache out of any wine, Davos said. Trade us oil, we'll take it. Our kitchen women will think better of us and might even roast their onions again. Arya spoke without looking up from the hawthorn's bark. There's a man of will with a scar on his wrist in the habit of crossing at night, she said. He wears a ring you could ransom a village with, and he thinks no one sees it. He owes 2 babies worth of goats and a dog. He can pay or lose the hand that wears the ring. Either way, bring him to the stones. I'll bring the Blackhaven boy, who has lightnings in his head, and he'll watch. Sir Nemor did not ask how she knew. He was not a fool. He looked at Ghost, who did not blink, and at Jon Snow's sister, who had learned to be a shadow that spoke, and he nodded. 2 babies and a dog, he said. We can keep such books. Keep them where men can see them, Gendry said. On a board on your side, on a board on mine. Make the boards big as a door and write the names large. Men are less likely to pretend if their neighbors can read their lies. Can your neighbors read? Sir Nemor asked. They can count children and dogs, Arya said. They made the bargain with oil and nails. It was not a treaty. It was a way to keep men fed. The prince in Sunspear, whichever prince it was, could put a seal on it if it pleased him. The Stormlands did not need seals to make soup. On the ride back, the wind had softened and the road was dust, not mud. Gendry minded the dust less than he minded squelch. It is a friendlier thing to find on boots. They passed a cart with a broken wheel, and a man sitting beside it, looking not at the wheel but at his hands, as if they had betrayed him, and he had forgiven them, and then found his forgiveness had been too easy. Gendry reined in. He climbed down. He put his shoulder against the axle while Denny's lifted, and Davos made jokes about old backs, and the Dondarrion boy counted to the right number without being asked. When the wheel sat true again, the man looked at Gendry, as if a lord had never pushed anything with his shoulder before. Perhaps many had, but not in front of him. He gave them a cheese that had sweated itself into the shape of the cloth it had been wrapped in, and cried when he did it, quietly, as if he knew the foolishness and could not stop his eyes behaving badly. Back at Storm's End, the sea had arranged itself into a story about distance and patience. The kitchen was louder. The argument about onions had been replaced by an argument about spoons. The woman Jon had promised had come. She wore a plain braid and boots that had seen more floor than field, and she introduced herself as Ryla, and then proceeded to take possession of the room with a serene cruelty. She used words as if they were knives for cutting dough. Economical, sure. Leaving edges clean. She put the onion women to roasting because she said the smell would calm a certain kind of man, and she took 3 spoons and threw them away because a spoon that had bent once would bend again at the wrong time. She looked at Gendry in the way of women who have known boys who needed to be fed 3 times a day, and told him where he would sit when he ate, then told him he could not sit there, because that table was for the people who cooked the food. He ate standing up by the hearth and discovered that his mouth smiled when it did not ask permission. He took Othmar to the forge and put him under Tormund's eye. Tormund's nose, bent twice, could sense a man who wanted to pretend. Othmar pretended once and had his hands wrapped lightly with the handle of a tool, and his pride wrapped harder. He spent the first half day at the bellows, and the second half day fetching water, and the third day learning to hold a piece of iron for the man who would hammer it. On the 4th day he cried when he did not plan to, and nothing was said. On the 5th day he struck once, with all the fury of a man who thinks a single blow can make a life right. The iron mocked him, and he learned to strike less hard and more true. Gendry watched from the doorway the way a man watches a hook he made hold fast. The world had the decency to behave. Letters went to Nightsong and came back from Nightsong, each with sand still clinging to the words. Harold wrote names carefully, as if he were carving them into oak. The shroud stitcher sat on the dais for 3 hearings, and then, when men had learned the shape of the thing, retired to tie garlic and onions with a string that made pretty bows because she could, and because it made the men who had been insolent the week before remember to put their hats in their hands when they walked through her space. The cousin without a chain learned to stand in a yard without forgetting it did not belong to him. He took to eating with the men who mucked the stables, and several times was seen to laugh. Ain hung in a cupboard as a reminder that chains can be put on and taken off, and the cupboard doors squeaked when opened until a boy remembered to ask for oil. Gendry set a board to be hung at the outer gate, the first of his boards. Lysa ruled the lines. He took the quill for the first 3 entries, wrote his name and the names of 2 boys who had nearly robbed him of his horse that morning by asking him for work with spears in their hands. He wrote the day. He wrote the work. He wrote what each would be paid in coin and bread. He hung the board and let anyone read it who could, and listened to those who could not while it was read to them. There were complaints. There were always complaints. He learned to hear the ones that had substance and the ones that were the sound a man makes when he finds he is living differently than the version of himself that drinks beside fires would prefer. He discovered that when he slept his dreams smelled like clean rope. Joan's ravens came less often and carried more weight when they did. They spoke of the Riverlands, where men who had known war too long found it hard to stop firing old quarrels like toys. They spoke of the Reach, where broken vines had learned new trellises that did not run to Highgarden anymore, but knew their own villages well enough. Once a raven brought a short letter with no seal, written in a hand that had once been taught to write by a woman who had been patient and precise. It said, "A boy named Edric asks after you. He has a hammer drawn on his wrist with ink. He says he was born under a roof that leaked, and he learned to sleep with his mouth shut. He is in Fairmarket. He is not safe if men remember to count kings. Yea, die." Gendry carried the letter in his breast for half a day, then took it out and read it again under the slit window, and did not feel his heart move faster or slower. He thought of a boy with a hammer drawn on his skin and wondered if the boy knew what it meant. He sent a man toward Fairmarket with a letter that said, "A man with a hammer on his wrist can eat at my table if he can show me he knows which end of it is work." Arya did not like ravens. She said they told lies to men who wanted to hear them. She liked boards, and she liked names that you could fit in a mouth easily. She brought Gendry 2 thieves one morning with their hands already open. "They're tired," she said. "Tired men do what is asked of them if the asking is not an insult." "Everyone is tired," Ryla observed from the hearth. "That's how you can tell a decent place. It makes you tired in a way that feels earned." Gendry put the thieves to hauling stone for the mason from Evenfall. He made them haul with a rope across their shoulders in the good old way, and then made them show him the rope burns on their skin at night, so he would know whether they had done it or merely followed the rope, while other men pulled. One of them tried to switch with another, and the rope tattled on him, and he was sent to scrub pans. He returned to stone hauling without being told. Arya watched and did not comment. Sometimes the easiest men to save were the ones who did not know how to make their own speeches. The company he had spoken of began without his noticing that it had begun. Stonehelm sent a man with eyes like polished flint, who said he had ridden with men who did not come back, and could not sleep unless he heard hooves outside his window. Blackhaven's boy Edwin asked to stay when the others went back. He said he had been told a bolt of lightning had once walked the halls of Blackhaven and set men right without a word, and he would like to see if Storm's End had any lightning of its own. A Morrigan crow showed up on a spear, and a Morrigan man behind it, with a face that laughed easily and hands that did not. He told jokes so badly that the men laughed, and then found themselves watching his hands the next day without meaning to, which pleased Gendry. A Rainhouse Wild sent a woman who did not give her name at first, and then, when it was clear that refusing to give a name caused more talk than giving one, said she was called Sella. Sella used a spear like a needle, and did not like onions whether roasted or boiled, and put pepper on everything as if daring the wind to sneeze. They rode the roads in pairs, then in fours, then in sixes, then back to pairs, when men grew too used to the comfort of company. They learned the names of dogs. They learned which farms would give water freely, and which would hide their buckets out of the habit that remains when a war is too long. They kept their spears where men could see them, and the spears grew less necessary. Gendry did not call them his men because he did not like the taste that left on his tongue. He called them the Storm's Watch, and it pleased the women in the kitchens to know their name rode the roads. One dusk, when the light had the color of old brass and the gulls were writing their rude letters across it, a small ship crept to the seaward steps. It flew no banner and did not need one. The sea knows its own. Davos was standing at the top of the steps before the first rope was thrown, which meant he had felt the arrival in his bones. Men made jokes that his bones had more tides in them than the bay. Davos did not mind jokes that were true. A man climbed the sea stairs with the swiftness of someone whose legs had promised him years ago that they would not let him down. He wore a green cloak and a salt-cut beard, and a smile that did not apologize for its own width. He found Gendry in the yard and swept him up as if he were still the boy turning a spit in a king's tent. "Sir Courtney Penrose?" Gendry blurted in shock, then heard himself, then saw. Not Penrose. Never Penrose. A memory had placed a man where there was another. The visitor smelled of tar and oranges, and something like victory that had not yet chosen a banner to sleep under. "Not Sir, and not Penrose," the man said cheerfully. "My father knew your father and my mother scolded him for it, and I have come to see whether the son is a man who scolds, or a man who laughs. I am Courtney, of nowhere you would like to be from, and I bring you a shipwright with hands and not stories." A man climbed after him carrying nothing but a hammer. The hammer's face was polished in the way of men who do not polish things for show. Gendry liked him at once and did not show it. The shipwright put his hammer down, took Gendry's hand, turned it as if looking at a piece of good wood to see which way the grain would go, and nodded. "We can set a slip in the lee of your outer steps," he said. "We can build you boats that do not look like boats until you need them to. We can teach your boys to caulk in a wind." "Why?" Davos asked pleasantly. He liked men who brought hammers. He liked them better when they explained their trade with all the ugly parts left in. "Because there's a current changing in the stepstones," Courtney said. "Pirates are not men who keep ledgers, but the man who owns their whorehouse does." He grinned at Arya, who had stepped into his sight like a rule. "Begging the lady's pardon. The lady hears worse words from men with better clothes," Arya said. "Go on." "The ledgers say men with no banners are buying fast boats with long oars," Court said. "That means somebody's going to need boats that can catch them, or somebody's going to need to learn to ignore them with such grace that the boats stop finding the right harbors." Gendry felt the wind change in the yard. It brought tar and pitch and the stink of money that moves too quickly. "We can build," he said. "We can," the shipwright said. "But we will need hands that can plane true, and eyes that can sight down a keel and see where the water will be before it's on it." "I have hands," Gendry said, "and eyes. Some of them read. Some of them don't. They all can learn where to wait. Ryla sniffed from the kitchen steps. "If you put boats on my shore," she said, "you will not bring your pirate friends to my pot. I know the difference between hunger and greed. Hunger can sit. Greed must be whipped." Courtenay bowed to her, as if she were a queen with flour on her cheek. "My lady," he said gravely, "I can be whipped if the stew is worth the welts." "Stew is for men who work," Ryla said. "We'll see if you are one." So the slip was laid, and men who had thought a hammer's only song was iron learned the sound it makes on oak. The smell of pitch entered the castle's old stone and offended no one who mattered. Boys who had never seen beyond the horizon past the gull's rude writing learned to look at the sea as if it were a long ledger that had to be balanced. Davos stood with his hands behind his back and did not interfere except to correct a man's reach when he might have fallen and to make a joke about a plank that made the plank do what it was told out of pride. A raven came from Sunspear with oil, and one from the Tor with a small skin of something sharper and sweeter, and one from Yronwood saying the man with the ring had come to the stones and paid 2 babies and a dog and a little more, because he did not like the way the girl with the knives had looked at his hand. The boards by the gate filled with names and lines drawn through most of them, which was a better thing than names left open, and men learned to come to read as if reading were a measure of a day and not a luxury. In the 2nd month, a stranger stood in the yard with mud up to his knees, and a tattoo of a hammer on his wrist in ink that had been renewed many times over. He had hair that did not know how to lie down, and a mouth that had learned to smile carefully, because sometimes smiling had been a mistake. He held his cap in his hands and did not look up at the banners, only at the boards. "You are Edric," Gendry said quietly. The boy looked up. He was not a boy, but he was to Gendry, because men keep some ages to measure other men by. He said, "a bastard of the king who loved too loudly." He squared his shoulders with a sudden anger that let you see how he had learned to walk. "If you want me dead to end a story, get on with it." Ryla snorted. "Nobody gets to die before supper is served," she said. "It makes the soup taste of metal." Edric blinked, shocked into not being brave by domesticity. Gendry took his arm the way a smith takes iron that is just going red to move it where it must be. He led him into the forge and sat him on a stool that had been his once, the way a man's bones belonged to him. Tormund looked up, saw the tattoo, grunted, and handed the boy the bellows handle. "Draw evenly," Tormund said. "If you pull like a man learning to kiss, you'll tire us all." Edric laughed, helplessly, and pulled. Gendry stood first beside him, then behind him, then in front of him, where a boy cannot see a man's face when he is deciding whether he will cry. Edric did not. He pulled the bellows clean. The iron in the coals glowed like a promise kept. Gendry said when the heat forced them out. "Then we will talk." They ate. Edric's hands shook. He hit it well, and not well enough for Ryla's eyes. She put the heaviest chunk of bread on his plate. He steadied. After, he sat under the arrow slit and told a story that had too many boats in it to be false. He had lived in 4 places where he had not been welcome, and 3 where he had been wished for, and found another man welcome instead. He did not ask for a lord's name or a lord's chair. He asked for work. "You can have it," Gendry said. "You can have it with your name on the board, where men can see it. If any man calls you king and expects you to live like one on my bread, he'll find the kitchen door shut in his face." Edric's mouth moved and stopped moving and moved again. He said, "I never wanted to be a king. I wanted to be a son." The world has made up its mind about that. The world changes its mind slower than iron cools, Gendry said. "But it does it. We'll tell it a different story about you." Edric learned to keep the ledger in his head while he worked, and to write enough of it that he could lay it on the board at night for other men to correct him. He learned that a well-balanced hammer keeps a man honest, because it tells lies back into his hand when he starts to tell them to himself. He learned the names of the kitchen women, and which one liked her onions roasted until they went sweet, and which scowled and ate them anyway. He slept in a loft and did not complain, which meant he had something left in him that could be tempered. Gendry walked the walls one night when sleep had refused him. Arya joined him without making a sound of joining. Ghost brushed his hip and nearly set him off his feet with the weight of a winter he had never learned to walk in. Across the black water, a smear of lights like a fallen necklace hinted at fishing boats where men sat and did not talk. The wind was doing its own thinking, and Gendry did not dare interrupt it. "You were kind," Arya said. "To Edric. He is a boy," Gendry said. "So am I. A little." "You are a lord," Arya said, and made it not an insult. "I am a smith," Gendry said. He felt the boards under his boots, the grit of salt on the stone under them, the eyes of the night. "I put my name on a board. That feels like a right thing. If I put my name on a man, it feels wrong." "Names on boards can hold men to their word," Arya said. "Names on men are a different work. They make different scars." Gendry thought of the chain in Nightsong's cupboard. "I'll keep to the boards." "Doe," Arya said. She set her elbow on the parapet and looked out. "Have you thought what you'll do when someone brings you a crown?" "They won't," Gendry said. "They will," Arya said. "Not because you want it, because they will need to see a shape when the wind blows. They'll try to put it on your head because you don't want it. Men do that when they are tired of being tricked by their own desires." Gendry did not say that he would throw it into the sea, because the sea would only throw it back, or teach him a lesson about throwing things. "I will hammer it flat and make a signboard," he said instead. "I'll write names on it until the gold shows through the paint." Arya's mouth made a shape that he had learned meant she was pleased and would not show it. "Good," she said. "I brought you a second thing." She set a small pouch on the stone between them. He looked at it as if it might argue. "Another nail?" he asked. "No," she said. "A thread. Brienne's. From her cloak, the blue one, cut when she mended the hem in a stable so she could ride without tripping on it." She hesitated. "I kept it because sometimes you keep a thing to promise yourself you saw what you saw. You keep it now. Storm's End will like it." He lifted the thread. It was blue like deep sky, and had a stubborn kink where it had once learned to lie against a different cloth. He tucked it with the nails. Work and a promise. That seemed enough to build a morning on. The morning brought a man from Griffin's Roost, which had been too quiet. He wore red, not too bright, and a griffin badge darkened by rubbing. He spoke carefully, as men do who have a house with a proud name and a history of hurt. Lord Connington would send his respects if he were more sure of being welcome in rooms where Baratheons sit, he said. "He asks that the roads between our lands be kept free of men who choose to forget who they're stealing from." "That's easy," Davos said from the door. "We'll forget who we're stealing from and stop doing it." The man grimaced, then let himself grin, because men who come with messages find it harder to do their work if they refuse ordinary humor. He asks also whether the Storm's Watch would consider riding a day east with one of his men to see a place where the road has disappeared into a man's yard. The man has decided the road is a mule that can be tied and made to eat from his trough. "Roads are not mules," Gendry said. "But men who think they are can be made to pull." He sent Sella with Edwin and 2 Stonehelm men and the Morrigan Crow to find the appropriated road. They returned 3 days later with dust in their throats and a story about a man with 10 daughters who had fenced a length of old royal road to keep men from cutting through and frightening his bees. He had thought himself clever until he had to carry his dead father around the fence, and found that he had made his own grief harder. They had taken down the fence with him, not for him, and he had wept while he worked and laughed when the last post came free. Sella kept his eldest girl's ribbon on her spear for a day because it had made the girl haughty in a way that pleased her. Gendry read this in Lysa's hand on the board, under the day's names, and nodded. The boards were teaching him how the land felt under the weight of men. He wrote beside it, "Be man to be allowed to use the side of the road for hives 2 months a year if carts can pass. We'll put stones to keep the wheels honest. E.G." It rained the next day, the kind of rain that encourages men to do inside work and makes them think well of walls. Gendry went to the armory because a wall that keeps the wet out is a kindness, but a spear that is not rusted is a future. In a corner, under a cloth, lay a hammer. Not a smith's hammer. A war hammer with an ugly, perfect head and a shaft wrapped for a hand that had loved breaking. He did not need to lift the cloth. He felt the shape through the fabric the way a man feels a scar in the dark with his own fingers. He pulled the cloth back. The storm's light made the metal worse. It remembered blood as easily as rain. The leather had been oiled by men who thought they were offering prayers to a god that had once given them a feast. Gendry set his hand on it and held it there until the shake left his wrist. "I don't want you," he said to the hammer, very softly. "I want your name on a board." Davos stood in the doorway a long time before saying anything. When he did not say that he had stood in doorways before and watched kings. He said, "That one will sit quiet if you don't make a fuss over it. If you do, it will sing. And then men who like songs like that will come with cups." "Menhour, I'm not thirsty," Gendry said. He put the cloth back, which is a ceremony when done right, and he turned and went back to the boards, which is another ceremony. He wrote, "Old hammer to stay under cloth, not to be trotted out for guests. If a man asks to see it more than once, feed him and send him on. Yao. G. and Siu." The mason from Evenfall finished the steps that would not slide when seaweed grew on them. The shipwright launched a narrow boat that looked like a lie until it took the water, and then looked like a story men would tell in kitchens. The watch brought in a man with a dog who had learned to bite hands and a child who did not cry unless it was quiet. Arya left for 3 days and came back with a women's ring wrapped in wool and set it on the board with no explanation. Men learned that sometimes a ring stood for a judgment, and sometimes it was just a ring, and the difference mattered less than they had thought it did. Jon returned with rain in his hair and stayed a night and left again because his feet had never learned to stop. He sat at the board and wrote a name beside Gendry's with the awkward hand of a man who had not done enough of it in rooms. He wrote, "Send me 2 of your best to ride to the crossing. They are making a bridge of men again. It will go badly if we let them." Gendry sent Sella and Daenerys. Sella for the way she set her spear down when she spoke. Daenerys for the way he made men think they were laughing first. He stood on the sea steps and watched them go and felt the wind weigh him. It seemed to approve. There were quarrels. There were always quarrels. A Morrigan boy bloodied a Dondarrion nose over a woman who preferred onions boiled to roasted and a lark that had not sung properly in the rain. They carried their quarrel to the board and wrote it down and then laughed at the words, because sometimes writing makes foolishness shame itself and leave. Lysa's desk filled with sand. Rylus ovens filled with bread. The forges filled with breath. The watch spears filled with nick marks, where hands had held them and learned their balance. The walls filled with the sort of silence that means men sleep. On a day that came out of a fog like a lesson, a raven came from Old Town bearing a hand that smelled of ink and old leather. It offered a name, Maester Harker, and an appeal to send the boy named Edric to the Citadel if he had a mind to learn letters more than he had a mind to swing a hammer. Gendry took the letter to Edric and put it in his hand and stood while the boy read it slowly, pointing with his finger to keep the letters in place. "I can learn letters here," Edric said, stubborn as a mule in a yard. "I can learn hammers here. I can learn to keep a ledger in my head and a board honest. I can learn a man's name and not put it on him when he doesn't want it." "You can learn pride here too," Gendry said. "The Citadel will teach you to write your name so men think it means something even when it doesn't. That is a dangerous craft." "I won't go," Edric said. "If you had told me to, I might have gone. You didn't. I want. Then we'll build you a desk that won't wobble," Gendry said. "You can put it by the forge and keep breath in your letters." In the evening, he took the blue thread and one of the small nails and fixed the thread above the box where the other nails lay, letting it hang like a piece of sky. He did not look at it often. He liked the idea that it was there when he did not look. It made a kind of honesty in the room that did not require witnesses. Lady Alysanne came with a sheaf of complaints from her island that all came down to men wanting to fish in waters that had been fished by other men's grandfathers, and thinking history was a permission. She sat with Gendry and wrote a rule that was not so much a rule as a reminder. If your grandfather didn't fish there, ask the man whose grandfather did if you may. Bring him an eel. Shake his hand. If he says no, go away. If you fight, I will put both of you on the wall in the rain, and you can talk there. It was posted on the board under her name. Men began to do as it said, some with eels, some with grudges that eels could not sweeten. The grudges learned to sit together and make faces at each other like old men at a hearth. At last, there came a day when the wind was quiet enough that the sea seemed almost to have lost its interest in men. Gendry walked the lower steps without being forced to hold the rope. He stood at the bottom, water over his boots, and looked up at the stone that had learned to be itself so completely that nothing could teach it otherwise. He thought of a chair that he sat now without being sat by it. He thought of a board with names. He thought of a hammer under a cloth. He thought of a nail and a thread. The first gull of the morning came low and rude, as if to remind him that even on quiet days, some things would not be made to behave. He laughed, unexpected as the gull's wing. He climbed. He went to work. News came as news does, out of breath, self-important, carrying its own weather. It said, the crossing is calm for now, but men are making new songs about old hatreds. It said, in the Riverlands, a certain house has put a salmon on a board and called it Justice. It said, the prince in Sunspear has sent olives large as thumbs and a little jar of salt from his own table, and a note that says your girl with knives frightens his steward, and he approves. It said, a man in a red cloak has been seen twice beyond the march with a boy on a pony and a look that suggests either rage or a stomach ailment. It said, a woman in King's Landing who calls herself Queen of the Market sells secrets at a price too low to be wholesome, and someone will kill her soon, and then this will be someone else's task. Ryla moved her spoons. Davos sharpened a quill with a knife that had seen more rope than meat. Lady Alysanne set another rule on the board about boats trying to outrun their own shadows. Arya put a piece of string around Ghost's ear, and he suffered it, as he suffers snow. Gendry took a spear and walked the wall. The wind came up from the south, bringing the smell of hot stone. He set the spear against the parapet and leaned on it, and let the weight of the day collect in his shoulders. A boy came and stood a careful distance away, looking not at him, but at where he looked. What do you see? Gendry asked. The sea, the boy said, surprised into saying the foolish thing. What else? Gendry asked. Work, the boy said after a moment. Good, Gendry said. You'll do. He walked on. The sea did its own thoughts in its own language. The wind considered men and did not judge them. The stone did not forgive, because it had never learned the things that need forgiving. He put his hand on it and found it as cool and indifferent and faithful as ever. Above his head the banner snapped, not with pride so much as with habit, and he thought, this will do. For now. And for now is all a man ever has if he means to keep it. He went down to the yard where the boards were, and took up the quill, and wrote the day. Then he wrote his name, and the work, and the pay.